Hi, it's actually Thursday, and Jeremy and I are doing our podcast Thursday afternoon because of Good Friday, but it'll air tomorrow, that is on Friday, as it usually does. Welcome, you know the drill. I'm John, he's Jeremy. We're doing this via Zoom. Today, our producer is in Florida, so this is a global podcast of sorts. Jer, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. How about you?
Good, thanks. I want to go deep today. We've talked about Russia and Ukraine, and we've talked a lot about it, but I'm not sure that we've really ever had a chance to go deep on it. And that's what I'd like to take some time on, because obviously you and I have talked on a personal level about this, but the key question is this a global tipping point? Is this not simply, if we look at the world history textbooks, not simply a new chapter, but, you know, several blank pages and then a part 6 in Roman numeral letters, ushering in an entirely new phase of world history? Is Russia and Ukraine part of something much, much larger than the invasion of one neighbor over another neighbor? I know you have a lot of thoughts on it, and I'm happy to have you get started, and I'm just as happy for me to get started. Your pleasure.
Why don't you start?
All right. Okay. I'm always prepared to start. The answer is a resounding and obvious yes. We are in a new phase of world history anyway, right? It's ushered in first and foremost by technology and the means of producing goods at faster paces, destroying and creating new jobs at faster paces, dislocation on a massive scale, mobility of people, mobility of communications, mobility of money, mobility of everything. Those of us, which means all of us experiencing this, are experiencing an incredible amount of turbulence from those in developing countries who many studies show will be starving at greater levels, to those of us who simply work for a living and at the very least see that our workplace has changed, if not our jobs have changed, or that we can't find in the short run new jobs, or the only ones we can find are not lucrative jobs. Yeah, that's all one piece of it. Another piece of it is on the geopolitical level. We have been living, to use the words of George H.W. Bush, in a period waiting for a new world order. We are not, as we have spent most of the time politically, geopolitically, throughout at least recent world history, there are not multiple grand global superpowers. There is one superpower, that's us, but we are a wounded and weakened superpower, especially in our capacity to enforce world order. There is another great and burgeoning superpower, and that is China, who is acting in every way like a global superpower, building infrastructure, buying nations, being the answer to us if we are the democratic superpower, albeit a wounded one, and democracy is in trouble. Then China is an autocratic power with a lot of followers, not simply those nations that it can buy off, but those who actually believe that in the interests of order and progress, that democracy is not the right answer. In steps Russia, a former global superpower, both as Russia, more so as the Soviet Union, and a worried and wounded power that invades a neighbor and does it on camera and does it in real time. And the whole world is watching, and the whole world, most of the whole world, is not cheering them on. In fact, doing a lot to stop them. The final point, the big player in all of this is China. China has been playing a low-key role thus far. If China opts to help Russia, then we're really at a tipping point. We are probably in World War III. Even so much as a green light that they would interpret to invade Taiwan, which would be horrific. Or China does not help Russia, in which case it decides Russia's on its own. It's made a mess of things in Ukraine. And besides China talking, what do we need Russia for? It's not a major player in our economy or that many of our sphere of influence. That's why we're at a tipping point. If Russia wins against the Ukraine, we see that bipolar situation emerge as World War III, China versus the US, China and allies versus US and allies. If Russia loses, then what you have is an empowered, I guess, United States rim against Russia and NATO. In any event, though, it's ugly, it's not pretty, and it's going to last a long time. We're at a global tipping point. What do you think?
We're definitely at a global tipping point, but I'd have to go to a couple things that you say and challenge it. I mean, of course, wouldn't it be a boring podcast if we agreed on everything? So the first thing I would start out with is I think it's inaccurate that most of the world disagrees with Russia. India has gotten close to Russia. We know China has gotten close to Russia. So, I mean, that's over 2.5 billion people right there. Then Russia still has many other allies within Central Asia, including Iran. There's really nothing coming out from South America or Central America as far as lambasting or attacking Russia. They're pretty silent. And even interestingly enough, sometimes some NATO members don't take as hard as a stand. So there are NATO members that are very much aligned with the United States. One would argue they kind of have to be, but to paint a picture that most of the world is against Russia, I think is just a reflection of consuming only Western media. If you go beyond Western media, wow, there's a whole world out there that we don't listen to. And that's probably why we're at a tipping point. That's part of the reason. The other thing is this definition, is the notion of Russian invasion. Well, yeah, they invaded. There's no doubt about that. But what I think people are overlooking, especially those who are getting their news from the mainstream media, is you go back to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And at this point, decades later, it's pretty much understood that Russia was lured in by the United States, that the intelligence forces, the intelligence agencies were funding the Mujahideen, were funding Osama bin Laden for the purpose of creating a Vietnam type situation in Russia. That is indisputable. That's a fact. I would say that it's indisputable, and it's a fact that that's exactly what has happened with Ukraine. Ukraine is not just this out of nowhere, February 24th, Russia invades. Oh, well, Russia is led by a madman named Putin. No, what people are forgetting is that Ukraine has been heavily armed by NATO forces ever since that there was a coup d'etat that forced out a pro-Russian government and brought in a pro-Western one that was bombastic and actually has, as I mentioned before, Svoboda has ties to neo-Nazis. They are neo-Nazis. Why was that important? Because when the eastern breakaway region known as Donbass with ethnic Russians naturally felt threatened by a neo-Nazi group and then wanted to break away and go with Russia, Kiev immediately started bombing that. And that created a humanitarian crisis, which nobody talks about unless you go into the independent media. So we focus on the humanitarian crisis going on right now among Western Ukrainians, but nobody's talking about the Eastern Ukrainians. And that's very problematic. So we have to understand that. And there's a very, very influential paper done by the Rand Corporation. I'm going to give you the title. It's called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia, which is a very friendly way of saying collapsing Russia. It goes back to 2019, and it looks at possibilities of how to overextend this empire and throw them out of balance. And one of them is quote unquote, I'm quoting it exactly, lethal aid to Ukraine. So NATO forces led by DC were gaming and calculating how they could draw Russia in by providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And so you have to wonder, well, maybe it is no wonder why Russia would invade. They saw an existential crisis happening on their border. All the while, all the former Soviet republics were brought into NATO. So who is the aggressor here? Can we really say that Russia is the aggressor, or is Russia the reactor? Whoever planted the seeds of war, I think it's pretty clear it was those elements that were arming Ukraine to the teeth to bring Russia in. That's in the Rand Corporation paper from 2019. So, I'll just say one other thing. We turn on the news and there's so much talk about Russia's invasion, Russia's bad, but it's almost like the journalists have forgotten over the last 20 years, how many nations has Washington, D.C. invaded themselves? I mean, Libya, black ops in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, most of the Middle East, including Somalia and Ethiopia. I understand that's Eastern Africa, but that's also culturally the Middle East. And of course we can throw Ukraine. So there's been all this meddling. There have been flat out invasions, and journalists are telling the story that Russia is the bad guy, but they seem to forget all of the empire building and all the chaos that has been caused by the forces of those in DC, intelligence and Pentagon. So it's very hypocritical. And so if you want to be objective and take a step back, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to solely pin the blame on Russia.
All right. And with that said, you've argued that good evidence. So my question becomes then, why did Putin allow himself, given your premise, why did he allow himself to become a patsy? I mean, why? What would he have had to gain by this invasion? And let's parse this. First of all, in the eyes of world opinion, all right, I misspoke on if you poll the world, but let's say there are a lot of nations, okay, that oppose Putin. Militarily, let's say particularly for Putin in a post-Afghanistan world, where was the hard intelligence and the sound assessment of that intelligence that would have suggested what we've seen here in the aftermath of this invasion, the fact that he's getting his butt handed to him militarily. Thirdly, why attack the West and the nerve center, the capital? There's a lot of good feeling, between the West and certainly the west of Ukraine. Why was there no attempt then at negotiating seriously? What most folks, I'm not going to say most, what a number of folks feel on the negotiating table is probably expendable anyway, which is southeastern Ukraine, which is heavily populated by Russians. It has a long history. They speak Russian in that part of Ukraine as a first language. So let's say Putin's not evil. Why is he stupid?
Well, he's not stupid. Well, I mean, I almost think that one could say, it's either he's coy and clever, or he, another approach could be he really tried to avoid war. I know that sounds laughable, right? That sounds crazy, but I wonder how much do journalists from NBC, ABC, CBS, and CNN, and even Fox News, how much do they talk about the Bucharest summit? How much do they talk about the Minsk agreement? I mean, you want to talk about diplomacy and negotiations. Well, that was the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement is actually where the forces within Russia and Ukraine came to a ceasefire, because this war had already been going on back to 2014. But there is a perception that Zelensky broke the Minsk agreement because Kiev on and off has been shelling the Donbas region, which is on the border of Russia. But even going back further, when I was in Prague, and I have to, I would like people to look this up. I wrote an article back in 2008 for Huffington Post. It was called "The View from Prague, Part 2." Missile defense systems. I was living in Prague, and people were up in arms and in the Czech Republic and Poland, because the United States wanted, they were recruiting these countries into NATO, and they wanted to build missile defense systems right near the Russian border. And the NATO was saying to Russia and Putin, "Don't worry, it's not for you. It's against Iran." To which Putin said, "Well, okay, if that's true, then why don't you let Russian soldiers come in and observe it, on a from time to time basis?" Well, that was Putin calling their bluff, you see, because Putin knew that it was directed at Russia. But in the article, I talked about how even the Czech Republic and Poland were split over this. It was almost half and half, where residents in those countries supported bringing the missile defense systems and opposed it. And I was making the case that this was the end of George W. Bush's presidency. And his presidency was, I said, would go down in history as a failure of a presidency that would really stand out among other presidents. And I said, if he is really concerned about his legacy, what he would do is he would stop this. And I quote, this is exactly what I say: "Pushing this issue will create a new Cold War in the future." And boy, was I right, because they didn't let up. That same year, there was this thing called the Bucharest Summit. This is where the United States and NATO officially recognized Kosovo as a nation. And on day one of the summit, and also entry of Romania and Bulgaria into NATO. And so on day one of the summit, they were talking about recognizing Kosovo, bringing in Bulgaria and bringing in Romania into NATO, and offering an open invitation to Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. Putin came on day two and said, "This is absolutely unacceptable. This is going too far." Remember the promise from George H.W. Bush back in the early 90s, not one finger's length, meaning we're not going to expand NATO into the former Soviet Republic nations. So year after year, it was broken. And what you see is an incredibly aggressive empire led by NATO to recruit those countries to build NATO bases, military bases on the Russian border. And there's silence from journalists. They don't talk about the Bucharest summit when Putin was pleading with people, "Stop it. Do not do this. This isn't going to be good." People don't report on the Minsk agreement when the Russians and the Ukrainians had agreed to ceasefire, but yet you still had talks from NATO and Washington, D.C. about funneling weapons in. So when you look at it from that perspective, you kind of get a whole other viewpoint, and you're less likely to see that Putin is a deranged psychopathic serial killer. Which I want to build on another thing, but maybe, after your turn.
I'm going to let you, because I want to move on to talk just a couple of minutes on a micro level, New York State, where we've just completed a kind of a fascinating poll. But let me just sum up that regardless of what the causes are, we're still debating, whether FDR knew that it was going to be Pearl Harbor that was invaded or somewhere else in the Pacific. So the motives, I think, will be discussed and studied for a number of years. The fact of the matter is, we both do agree that this is a tipping point, that this has broader ramifications
Absolutely.
globally, and not just in the short term. Go ahead, finish your point.
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand that also that there's such a phenomenon as wartime propaganda, and we only know what we're being told. And there's all kinds of imagery, and the media is very in uniform in terms of the narrative. That, I mean, go back to World War One, and when it became obvious that the United States was becoming interested in engaging in World War One. This, of course, was before the Lusitania, but there was such a hard push from the public to be non-interventionist. There was propaganda coming out that German soldiers were putting babies on bayonets, babies on bayonets. And this is repeated throughout every war. I mean, they did this to Saddam Hussein. They did this to Muammar Gaddafi. One has to say, are we really getting the news? Are we really getting the accurate description? Because there are some former generals, and I forget their name, but I don't think we should charge them as being conspiracy theorists, but they more or less believe that what the Russian military, being directed by Putin, is doing is that they're trying to kill the supply lines of the lethal aid to Ukraine, and that in the instances where the Russians do go into the cities like Kiev, there are reports that whether it's the Azov battalion, another neo-Nazi group, or whether it's just the Ukrainian military in general, that the Ukrainian military are acting as human shields, kind of similar to what Hezbollah does when they're under attack by Israel or any other group that had been under attack.
I finish, but I don't like where we're going with this. But go ahead, finish.
Well, we have family members who used to talk about this with Hezbollah, that they were using the population as human shields. We don't have to say that the Ukrainian military are saints. We don't have to say that they are perfect. We could say that there is potential that they are doing that.
But we're also not going to go down the road of suggesting that what we see day in and day out are deep fakes. I mean, those are real bodies. Those are real civilians. Those are men and women and children.
I didn't say that. What I said was that there are, interestingly enough, that there are former generals who are reporting this, and that's all. That was all my point. I mean, if you want to take it further, that's up to the listener. But I do find it intriguing that there is alternative information. It's just not really necessarily being highlighted. Remember, in times of war, there are no saints, so you really can't put it past really either side. But
okay, I'm going to just call attention to the fact, those who are listening, watching, or reading, that John Zogby Strategies has a new poll that came out just yesterday, New York State voters. It's a poll that we conducted last weekend, entirely before the resignation of the lieutenant governor, now former Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin, for, let's just call it, simple graft, just basic political corruption. But raises some serious questions about Governor Hochul's decision making process, and her governorship, whether or not it deserves to be called a breath of fresh air after Mario Cuomo. No, let's make that Andrew Cuomo. In any event, we've discovered that she, of course, is leading all of the Republicans that are in the Republican primary, but against the front-running Republican, Lee Zeldin, she leads by 13, polling under 50. And we're going to continue in a series of analyses to show, number one, why we believe this race is going to be much more competitive than the double-digit lead that she has. And number two, why voters think that some political reforms can actually be enacted. And number three, why New Yorkers are still at a 39% level ready to leave New York. A very high number, 39%. So that's it for this week. And we'll pick up wherever we pick up next week. This was a good conversation.
Yeah, but I have to say I'm very troubled that you jumped to the conclusion that I was suggesting deep fakes and fake imagery. That is a leap that I did not even suggest nor even think. But when I'm talking about using the public or the population as human shields, what that means is that the imagery of people being bombed and killed is real. It's just that those attacks are now happening because one military is going after another who may or may not be hiding among the population. That does not suggest deep fakery. So I'm very troubled by that accusation.
Okay, we'll talk next week.